This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real events. Names, dates, locations, and identifying details have been changed or dramatized to protect privacy and enhance the narrative. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental or used fictitiously. This content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not aim to glorify crime, promote violence, or pass judgment on real individuals. Viewer discretion is advised. Some scenes may contain mature, disturbing, or triggering content. What you are about to watch could have happened anywhere, to anyone. It's inspired by real events. Whispers of truth buried beneath layers of fiction. We've changed the names, the dates, the locations, but the emotions, the betrayal, the fear, those are real. This story is not meant to accuse, only to reveal, to make you question, who do you really trust? If stories like this keep you thinking, long after they end, hit subscribe, smash like, and drop your theory in the comments. Now watch closely, before the truth disappears again.
It was a calm Thursday night in Hamilton County, Texas. The kind of evening where porch lights flickered on just before supper and the cicadas hummed like a tired prayer. Nothing about that night seemed out of place, not until 9:41 p.m. A 911 call came through dispatch, panicked, breathless, barely coherent. A woman's voice, trembling and sharp, choked out 5 words that no one would forget. I did what I had to. There was blood on the porch steps, a sheriff's badge smeared with it, a pair of surgical scissors, rusted from the handle to the blade, glinting beneath a half-moon sky. The street was quiet. The neighbors watched from behind curtains, stunned into silence. No gunshots, no shouting, just the faint sound of sobbing behind the bedroom door. Inside the house, a man lay curled on the floor, hands bound, writhing, and next to him, a teenage boy with his head buried in a pillow, whispering to himself over and over, "She said she'd protect me." The sheriff's department was already on the scene by 9:49 p.m., but the woman who opened the door wasn't just another civilian. She was one of their own, Sheriff Loretta Mayfield, decorated, trusted, the face of law and order in a town that didn't welcome outsiders and barely tolerated her rise to power. Now she stood barefoot, blood soaking the hem of her nightgown, eyes wide but unblinking. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "He touched my boy. I warned him." Those were the last words she said before handing over her weapon and turning herself in. But the real story didn't begin with that 911 call. It began years earlier, with a woman loved by her community, with a marriage praised in church pews, and with a secret that crawled behind the walls of a quiet house, long before justice bled onto the carpet. This is not a case of madness, not a crime of impulse. This is the story of what happens when a mother in uniform becomes the only line between her child and a predator she once loved, and what she chose to do when the law was no longer enough. Stay with us, because what happened inside that home is more than crime. It's the reckoning of everything we think we know about protection, justice, and family. Hamilton County wasn't the kind of place people pass through. You either belonged there or you didn't. Dirt roads stretched like veins across the land, and the air always carried a trace of gunpowder and gospel. Sundays were for church, Fridays were for football, and everything in between was ruled by a quiet code. Minding your business, respecting the badge, and never airing your family's mess in the open. So when Loretta Mayfield first ran for sheriff, folks didn't know what to make of her. She was black, she was a woman, and she wasn't married to the Mayfield name by birth, but by love, or so everyone thought. They said she walked like a woman who had nothing to prove, and spoke like someone who'd already buried her doubts. Clean record, military vet, law enforcement degree from Prairie View. Tough on crime, but gentler than most when it came to first-time offenders. She believed in second chances, she believed in structure, but most of all, she believed in protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves. In her first term, crime dropped by 17%. Drug busts increased. Domestic calls decreased. She had a way of walking into a room and making even the hardest men sit up straight. Her eyes did the talking. The badge did the rest. She brought in community programs for at-risk youth, partnered with the church for monthly food drives. She didn't just police the town, she became part of it. She was invited to weddings, barbecues, even baby showers. She made it easy to forget she was once an outsider. And standing beside her, always smiling quietly, was her husband, Darnell Mayfield. A tall man, clean-shaven, always in a pressed shirt and church shoes. A former corrections officer who had stepped away from the system years back, citing burnout and family priorities. He became the silent backbone of the household while Loretta worked late shifts and ran department meetings. He cooked most nights, drove their son to school, made sure the yard was trimmed and the bills were paid. If Loretta was the face of law and order, Darnell was the image of a stable, God-fearing man. Their home sat on the edge of town, past the last streetlight, where the road turned gravel and the stars looked close enough to touch. It was a 3-bedroom ranch with white shutters and a garden out front. Neighbors would often wave as they passed, and some even joked that the Mayfields were Hamilton County's version of royalty. A sheriff, a deacon, a beautiful boy. Elijah, E.J., as everyone called him, was quiet like his father, but smiled more like his mother. He loved to sketch, always had a notebook in hand, drawing trees, animals, sometimes comic book heroes. He made honor roll every year, didn't get into fights, didn't talk back. He was the kind of child people pointed to and said, "That boy's going to make something of himself." No one suspected a thing. Not when Loretta showed up late to town meetings with tired eyes. Not when EJ stopped attending youth choir without explanation. Not even when Darnell stopped shaking hands and started standing a little too far behind his son during church services. Because in Hamilton County, people believe what they see, and what they saw was a family, whole, stable, untouchable. But they didn't see the way Loretta paused sometimes before pulling into her own driveway, or how she kept the porch light off when Darnell was home alone with their boy, or the nights she parked outside the house in her patrol car, engine running, staring at the window with her hand resting on the holster at her hip. People called her fearless, but fear was the one thing she lived with every single day. And in the town that trusted her the most, no one ever asked why. They met in a storm, not a real one, but the kind that brews in the mind. Loretta was fresh out of the military, still carrying the discipline in her posture and the silence in her eyes. Darnell was already working at the county jail, quiet and unreadable, the kind of man who stood in the back of the room, but always heard everything. They were introduced at a department training. Loretta had asked a question no one else dared to, something about use of force protocol. Darnell had looked up from his notepad and nodded like he already knew her. That night he asked her to dinner. No flashy words, no games, just straight honesty. "I see the way you carry your weight," he said. "I respect it." It was the kind of sentence that stayed with her. So she stayed with him. They married within a year. A courthouse ceremony, no guests, just rings and signatures. Loretta never cared for the spectacle. She believed in structure. She believed in promises. At first, their love looked like alignment. Both understood duty. Both had seen the inside of institutions that broke people. They worked side by side, built a life brick by brick. Then EJ was born. Everything changed. Darnell quit his job, said the system was too corrupt, too draining. He wanted to be home. Loretta supported him. She believed in the importance of a father figure. She worked longer hours, took double shifts, ran for sergeant, then lieutenant, then sheriff. And while she climbed, he stayed. He took care of EJ. He cooked. He fixed things around the house. He went to church. He smiled at the right moments. But something shifted. It started with little things. Darnell began calling her at work, constantly. Not emergencies, just questions he already knew the answers to. What time would she be home? Who was at the station with her? Was she wearing the blue uniform or the white one today? He checked her mileage, asked for receipts. She dismissed it at first, called it protective, called it love. Then it got worse. He stopped going to church unless Loretta drove. He hovered during parent-teacher meetings, corrected EJ's stories, asked Loretta if she thought their son was turning soft. He didn't like EJ's drawings, said they were too quiet. He didn't like how Loretta let him choose what books to read, said it made the boy think too much. He said it with a smile. But Loretta started noticing how EJ flinched when the front door slammed. She started noticing how Darnell never let EJ close his bedroom door all the way. Then one night, she found EJ asleep on the couch, blanket balled under his neck, face red from crying. When she tried to pick him up, he shook his head. "No, Mama. I'm okay here." She stood there, frozen, staring at a child who no longer felt safe in his own bed. She didn't sleep that night. Darnell said he was just being firm, that boys needed discipline, that she was too soft, always trying to understand everything. He said her job had made her forget what a real man looked like. Loretta stared at him and said nothing. She started coming home early, stopped announcing her arrival, watched how Darnell adjusted himself when she entered a room, watched how EJ started stuttering again, something he hadn't done since he was 6. One afternoon, she picked EJ up from school. He sat in the back seat, quiet, fingers twitching. "Is Daddy nice to you when I'm not home?" she asked. He didn't answer. He just looked out the window and whispered, "Can we get ice cream?" That night, she turned off her phone, sat in her patrol car outside the house with the engine running. She watched the upstairs light. She watched the hallway. She watched her family through glass. And for the first time in her life, Loretta Mayfield didn't feel like the law. She felt like a stranger inside her own home. The change was slow, like a faucet dripping in the dead of night. You don't hear the first drop, but eventually it becomes the only sound in the room. EJ was 10 the first time he stopped inviting friends over. He said the house was too quiet, said his dad didn't like noise. Loretta brushed it off, thought maybe he was just getting older, more private. Some kids do that. But then he started locking the bathroom door even when he was brushing his teeth. She noticed how he double-checked his bedroom window at night, like he needed a way out. Then came the night terrors, screams that tore through the house, sharp and sudden. He never remembered what the dream was, but he'd wake up drenched, shaking, eyes darting toward the hallway. Darnell said it was just a phase. "Boys have imagination," he said. "Let him cry it out, builds backbone." But Loretta had spent her entire life studying behavior, inmates, victims, survivors. She knew the difference between a bad dream and a silent scream. Still, there was no bruise, no mark, no hard evidence, only moments, tiny, quiet moments, like the way EJ flinched when his father put a hand on his shoulder, or how he avoided eye contact when asked a direct question, or the way he tensed up every time someone knocked on the front door after dark. Loretta tried to talk to him, just mother to son, but he would freeze up, eyes darting, hands trembling. "No one's hurting me, Mama," he said once. "I promise. Daddy's just strict." Strict. That word hit her harder than a bullet. Strict wasn't supposed to make a child tremble. Strict wasn't supposed to make a child sleep with a baseball bat under his bed. She started watching them, really watching, from the corner of her eye at dinner, through the sliver of a cracked door at night. Darnell had a way of talking to EJ that didn't sound harsh. It sounded normal, calm, measured, but every word was a leash. Every question was a chain. "How was school? You tell anyone your mom's working late again? You didn't draw that weird stuff in class again, did you?" And EJ just nodded, always nodded. Loretta checked his phone. Nothing strange. Checked his search history. Clean. But the drawings told a different story. Sketches hidden in the back of notebooks, pages torn from journals and shoved behind his dresser, faces with hollow eyes, a boy standing behind a locked door, a tall shadow watching him sleep. She brought one of the sketches to work, showed it to a child psychologist who worked with the department. He didn't say much, just looked up and asked, "Has this child been questioned for trauma?" Loretta lied, said she found it at a traffic stop, just some kid passing through. But something inside her cracked. She drove home that night like she was chasing a fugitive. But there was no siren, no emergency call, just a mother's instinct pulling her back toward a house that didn't feel like a home anymore. She sat in the driveway for 20 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the light in EJ's room. It flickered once, then went dark. She didn't tell anyone what she found, not the department therapist, not her deputy, not even her sister in Dallas, the only person she ever confided in. She went quiet, but quiet isn't the same as still. Loretta stopped leaving the house without locking every door, even the ones inside. She installed a second bolt on EJ's bedroom. She placed a camera near the hallway and another behind the bookshelf in the living room. She told Darnell it was to catch burglars. He nodded like he believed her. But he stopped letting EJ be alone for too long. The boy couldn't even go to the bathroom without Darnell knocking within minutes, asking if he was okay, asking if he needed anything. Loretta started working from home more, citing back pain, a paper trail she was careful to build in case someone ever questioned her. She read every child protection protocol she'd ever taught at the academy. Every paragraph hit differently now. She knew how fragile evidence could be when it came to a father and a child. She knew that suspicion without proof meant nothing, especially in a county that barely trusted her to wear the badge in the first place. So she waited and watched. Until one night she saw what she needed to see. She'd gone out to buy groceries, left the living room camera rolling. It captured 38 minutes of footage. Darnell sitting close beside EJ on the couch. Too close, hands on the boy's shoulders, voice too soft to pick up. EJ frozen, not moving. At one point the boy flinched. Darnell smiled. That smile, cold, calm, familiar, was the last thing Loretta saw before she stood in the middle of her kitchen and vomited into the sink. The next day she pulled EJ from school early. They sat in the car outside a gas station, windows down, the sound of trucks passing through like a heartbeat too loud to ignore. She didn't ask questions, just said his name. He stared at the dashboard. She said it again. Then she said the words she had never said before. "Baby, I think your daddy hurt you. You can tell me if he did. You won't be in trouble. You won't be alone." He didn't cry. He didn't shake. He just said one sentence. "He told me you'd never believe me." Loretta gripped the steering wheel so tight her hands went numb. Her mind started calculating things. Court filings, removal orders, CPS reports. She knew the chain of custody. She knew the state wouldn't move fast. Not in Hamilton County. Not without a full investigation. Not without bruises. Not without more than just a drawing and a video that showed nothing explicit. She knew what had to be done. That night she waited until Darnell fell asleep. She opened the drawer where he kept his Bible and his insulin. She replaced the camera's memory card. She opened her laptop. She made a folder, labeled it "For the Court." Then she did something she hadn't done in months. She prayed, not for guidance, not for clarity, but for strength. Because whatever came next would not be legal, and it would not be merciful. She sat at the kitchen table with the lights off. Her badge rested beside her phone. Her holster lay on the floor. The scissors were still in their plastic package, unopened, sitting between two manila folders filled with paperwork no one had asked for. She hadn't cried. She hadn't screamed. She just sat, silent, awake, waiting for the feeling of being a mother to overpower the part of her that was still a sheriff. But that feeling never came. What came instead was a calculation. She knew the courts would drag their feet. She knew Darnell would lie. She knew EJ would freeze under pressure, and that the words he finally found in the car would dissolve on the stand like smoke. She knew this town, this system, this history, and she knew what men like Darnell counted on. Silence. So she broke it. She logged into her department portal, flagged a request for unpaid medical leave. 2 weeks. Enough time to disappear in plain sight. She cleared her browser history. She checked their bank account. She called in a favor to a former Army medic she hadn't spoken to in years. Asked if testicular trauma was survivable. The answer was yes. Painful, humiliating, but survivable. That was all she needed to hear. The next morning, she drove EJ to school, kissed him on the forehead, and told him she'd pick him up early. He didn't smile, but he didn't look scared either. She stopped by a hardware store, bought a tarp, duct tape, gloves, bleach, and a lock for the inside of the guest bedroom. Then she drove home, parked in the garage, closed the door behind her, and sat in silence. She was going to commit a felony. She was going to mutilate a man in his sleep, and she wasn't sorry, because this wasn't revenge. Not to her. It was protection. Delayed, but not denied. That night she cooked dinner like she always did. Gumbo. Darnell's favorite. He told her it tasted better than usual. EJ stayed quiet through the meal. Loretta didn't force him to talk. She just placed a piece of cornbread on his plate, looked him in the eye and said, "Everything's going to be okay." He nodded, and that was enough. After dinner, she cleaned the kitchen, checked the locks, and waited for Darnell to fall asleep. Then she sat on the edge of the bathtub with the scissors in her lap. She held them like they were sacred, the kind of tool not meant for punishment, but for closure. And in her head, she repeated one line again and again, like a chant. I warned him, because she had, in the beginning when things were still soft between them, when she saw the way his eyes lingered too long on the child they made together. She had warned him, and now she was going to finish what the system refused to start. There would be no trial, no appeals, no loopholes. Just one mother, one pair of scissors, and one man who mistook her silence for weakness. The house was quiet, too quiet. She'd always thought justice would feel like a gavel hitting wood, loud, final, sharp. But this was quieter than death. Darnell was asleep in their bed, face buried in a pillow, snoring softly. The television was still playing, a rerun of a basketball game, the crowd cheering faintly through the walls. Loretta stood in the doorway and watched him breathe. She had memorized his sleep patterns over the years, how he turned onto his left side around midnight, how he pulled the sheet up to his chin even in the summer, how his mouth stayed just slightly open. She walked to the dresser, pulled on latex gloves. The scissors were tucked into her waistband, hidden beneath her sweatshirt. She didn't tremble. Her heartbeat was steady, her breath low and silent. She stepped closer. EJ's room was locked. He was safe. She'd given him melatonin and a hug that lasted too long. She told him he'd feel better in the morning. Darnell rolled over slightly. She paused. Then she moved, one knee on the bed, one hand pressing against his chest. His eyes opened. Too late. She hit him once. Hard, just above the neck. Not to kill him, just to stop him from talking. He groaned, tried to move. His arms reached up, but her knee held him down. She whispered only once, "You will never touch my son again." Then the scissors came out, a flash of metal in the dark. The first cut was fast. The scream was instant. He flailed, bucked, cursed, half asleep, half bleeding. She didn't stop. The second cut took longer. He cried out for God, for mercy, for help. None came. Blood soaked the sheets. The sound of the game on the TV got louder, like the universe refused to hear what was happening inside that room. She stood up when it was done, dropped the scissors on the nightstand, walked out. Darnell writhed, curled in on himself, hands between his legs, body shivering with shock and pain. Loretta walked down the hall, opened the guest bathroom, and vomited. Then she cleaned her hands, slowly, methodically, like she had practiced. She walked outside. The night air hit her like ice. She dialed 911, and in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else, she said, "My name is Sheriff Loretta Mayfield. I've committed a violent assault in my home. I need officers here now. The victim is still alive." Then she sat on the front steps, barefoot, covered in blood, and waited for her own badge to come and take her away. The sirens didn't scare her. What scared her was how calm she felt watching the red and blue lights flicker across her lawn, painting the walls of her home like a warning. She didn't run, didn't raise her voice, didn't ask for a lawyer. When the first patrol car pulled up, she stood slowly, hands already raised, eyes blank but focused. Deputy Curtis James was the first to approach. Young, nervous. He'd trained under her just 2 years before. He couldn't hide the shake in his hands. "Sheriff Mayfield, what's going on?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her wrist toward him and said, "Use the steel cuffs, Curtis, not the plastic ones." Inside, Darnell was still alive. Barely. The bedroom was a mess of blood and linens. His screams had quieted to sobs, the kind that didn't sound human anymore. Paramedics rushed in. One of them turned his head and threw up in the hallway. The other just kept repeating, "Oh my God, oh my God." EJ remained locked in his room, silent. When the officers knocked, he opened the door slowly, clutching a pillow to his chest. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't cry. He just looked at his mother through the crowd of uniforms and said one word, "Safe?" She nodded once. He closed the door again. They walked her out in cuffs, barefoot, blood still on her clothes, her sheriff's star still pinned to her chest. Reporters arrived within the hour. Some locals, some from Austin. The story traveled fast. Sheriff assaults husband in his sleep. Sheriff mutilates man in his own bed. Sheriff Mayfield loses control. But none of them knew what had really happened. Not yet. The headline was too easy, too sharp, too clean. She was booked like every other suspect, photographed, fingerprinted, questioned. They took her badge, her weapon, her dignity, but not her truth. When asked why she did it, she spoke with no hesitation. My son is alive. He's breathing. He's not broken. That's why I did it. It wasn't the statement they wanted. It wasn't filled with remorse. It wasn't softened with legal excuses. It was a declaration. She was moved to a holding cell, then to a county facility out of district to avoid conflict. Meanwhile, Darnell underwent emergency surgery. He lived. Doctors said the damage was permanent. Nerve trauma, psychological trauma, a life forever altered. He refused to give a full statement. Said he had no idea why his wife would attack him. Said he'd always been a good father. But whispers started before the wounds healed. Neighbors, church members, teachers who had seen too much but said too little. A picture began to form, not just of a man in pain, but of a boy who had lived in silence for too long, and of a mother who had chosen the one form of justice the courts couldn't offer: certainty. There was no gray left in her story, only blood and scissors, and a child still breathing on the other side of it all. The booking photo spread across every news channel in Texas before sunrise. Her eyes weren't red. Her face wasn't swollen. No smudged mascara or broken composure. Just stillness. The kind you only see in people who have already made peace with what they've done. The media called her the Vigilante sheriff. The blade in blue. They speculated everything. An affair, a mental break, drug use. No one wanted to believe the real story. It was too close, too real, too ugly to fit inside a headline. Back in Hamilton County, people took sides. Some stood on the courthouse steps with hand-painted signs that read, "Free Loretta." Others called for maximum sentencing, screaming that the law doesn't belong in the hands of the angry. But none of them knew what happened in that house. Not the full story, not yet. EJ didn't go back to school. He stopped speaking for days. Not a word, just silence. He'd stare at walls for hours, sit in corners with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, even when it was warm. Social services got involved. They asked questions. He nodded sometimes, but the words wouldn't come. The court appointed a guardian. Interviews were scheduled. Psychological evaluations were ordered. And while the system turned its wheels, Loretta sat in a 6x8 cell with a cot, a toilet, and a cracked ceiling tile. She stared at every night until sleep finally took her. She didn't ask for visitors, didn't speak to reporters, didn't answer the letters piling up from strangers calling her a monster, and from others calling her a hero. Her attorney filed for bail. It was denied. Flight risk, the judge said. Danger to the community. She smirked when she heard it, as if the idea that she would hurt anyone else was laughable. Darnell, meanwhile, left the hospital in a wheelchair, moved into a motel under police protection. He gave one interview, soft lighting, gentle music, crocodile tears. He said he'd forgiven his wife, said he didn't understand what had gone wrong. He never mentioned EJ, not once. That silence told its own story. Investigators began combing through the evidence Loretta had left behind. Video footage, drawings, transcripts, call logs. The case shifted. The prosecution grew nervous. This wasn't a clean assault case anymore. It was layered, murky, emotional. A possible child abuse case buried beneath a mutilation. The sheriff's department issued a public statement, distancing themselves. We are cooperating fully with the investigation. Our thoughts are with all parties involved. But behind closed doors, some deputies whispered her name like a prayer. Others whispered it like a curse. One thing was certain, she had made the impossible choice, and everyone watching had to ask themselves the same question. If it were your child and no one was coming to help, what would you have done? Because Loretta Mayfield didn't wait for the court. She didn't wait for therapy or paperwork. She took the law out of the books and into her hands, and now the whole world would have to decide if she was a mother or a criminal. The trial began on a Monday morning under gray skies. Journalists lined the courthouse steps before sunrise. Camera crews battled for position. Protesters held signs, some with Loretta's photo and the words, "She protected her child." Others with phrases like, "No one is above the law." The line to enter the courtroom wrapped around the block. Inside, the air was thick. Reporters whispered. Jurors shifted in their seats. The judge, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and a spotless robe, tapped the gavel and began what would become one of the most watched trials in Texas history. Loretta entered in shackles. She wore no makeup. Her hands didn't shake. She didn't glance toward the gallery, didn't look for sympathy, didn't blink when the prosecutor called her a cold, calculated mutilator. The state argued she had other options. They said she had failed to report a crime, that she let emotions cloud her judgment, that she had become what she was sworn to fight against. Lawlessness. They showed the photographs. They played the 911 call. They described in graphic detail what she had done with those scissors. The courtroom didn't flinch. They winced, but they didn't flinch. Then came the defense. Her lawyer didn't play her as a hero. He didn't use theatrics. He just laid out the timeline. He showed the drawings, the video stills, the door locks, the placement of the cameras. He explained how many times she had followed protocol, how many times the system had looked the other way, how many silent nights had been endured before a single drop of blood was shed. He called one witness, a child trauma expert. She took the stand and looked every juror in the eye. Children who live with abuse don't always scream. They hide, they shrink, they conform to survive. By the time they speak up, it's usually too late. Sheriff Mayfield didn't wait until it was too late. Darnell never appeared. His lawyer claimed emotional distress. But even in his absence, his presence was heavy in the room, especially when EJ's letter was read aloud. It was handwritten, no signature, just 3 sentences. "I didn't feel safe. She made me feel safe again. Please don't take her away." The courtroom fell silent. Not even the judge moved. It was the first and only time EJ's voice entered the trial. The prosecution tried to dismiss it as hearsay, but it stayed with the jury. So did Loretta's expression as it was read. No tears, just stillness. The trial lasted 9 days. The jury deliberated for 7 more. Outside, the world argued. Inside, 12 strangers sat in a sealed room and asked themselves whether a crime committed in love could ever be forgiven by the law, and whether a mother's instinct was reason enough to draw blood. EJ never stepped inside that courtroom, not once. They called his name, subpoenaed him, offered therapy, promised protection, but every time the door opened, he stayed seated in the hallway, arms wrapped around his chest, eyes locked on the floor. He wasn't the same boy anymore. He didn't laugh. He didn't draw. He barely slept. He answered questions with nods or shrugs. No matter how many professionals surrounded him, he only trusted one person, and she wasn't allowed to speak to him. The court placed him with a temporary guardian. An older couple, nice people, kind enough. But they weren't her. They didn't know how to calm his breathing when it quickened. They didn't know the right songs to hum when his hands started to shake. They didn't know what it meant when he sat too still for too long. Every few days he would ask if she was coming home yet. Every time, the answer was a different kind of no. The state kept him away from the cameras. No interviews, no statements. But people talked. Online, in barber shops, in church parking lots. Everyone had an opinion. Some said he was being used. Others said he was faking. But no one saw the boy sitting cross-legged in a therapist's office trying to answer a question that made his throat close. "What did your father do?" He couldn't say it. Not yet. Not out loud. So he wrote it. Pages and pages. None of it legal testimony. Just memories. The way the door never closed all the way. The sound of footsteps outside his room. The nights he pretended to be asleep so he wouldn't have to speak. And the morning after it all ended, when he woke up and found the house quiet. No fear, no footsteps. Just quiet. He wrote that down too. Later, the therapist would say he had entered a phase called selective mutism, that the trauma had settled deep, far beyond language. But Loretta had already known that. She knew her son's silence was louder than any scream he could ever make. The letters never made it into the trial. They weren't allowed. But they lived in a folder now, sealed by the court. Untouched, protected, like him. And that, more than anything, was what Loretta had wanted. Not justice in the eyes of the law, not vindication in public opinion, just safety, a locked door, a quiet night, and a child who no longer had to pretend to be asleep. That was her victory, and her sentence. They called the jury back in on a Thursday morning. The room was silent. Not the nervous kind of silence, but the kind that wraps around your throat and makes you forget how to breathe. Loretta sat in her seat, hands folded in her lap, face expressionless. She didn't look at the jurors. She didn't look at her lawyer. She looked straight ahead as if the outcome had already happened days ago, somewhere inside her mind. The foreman stood. The judge asked for the verdict. He cleared his throat. On the charge of aggravated assault with intent to maim, we find the defendant, Loretta Mayfield, guilty. There was no gasp, no outrage, just the sound of 100 heartbeats pounding in unison. Loretta didn't blink. She only nodded once. But the foreman continued. However, due to mitigating circumstances and the evidence of long-term endangerment to a minor, we recommend a reduced sentence. 8 years with eligibility for parole after 3. The courtroom shifted. Some sat back in their chairs, stunned. Others looked around as if waiting for someone to explain what they just heard. The judge nodded slowly, tapping the edge of his gavel with his fingertips. He leaned forward and spoke softly, but every word landed like stone. I sentence you not just as a sheriff, but as a citizen who chose to act outside the law. Not as a murderer, but as a mother who failed to trust the system she swore to uphold. You broke the law, but you did so while trying to protect what you believed the law would not. He paused, then looked her in the eyes. I don't know if I would have done the same, but I know I'll never forget that you did. He banged the gavel once, and it was over. Reporters rushed outside. The verdict flashed across every screen. Guilty but spared. The debates reignited. Some said it was too light. Others said she should have walked free. But Loretta didn't care about the noise anymore. As the guards led her back through the courthouse corridor, she asked one simple question. Can I write to my son? They said yes. And that night, in a cell far from home, she wrote a letter on yellow paper. It didn't talk about guilt, or scissors, or blood. Just 3 short sentences. I love you, baby. You are safe now. Don't let the world tell you what you lived through didn't matter. She folded the page carefully, sealed it, and waited for morning. The story didn't end with the verdict. It lingered, in whispers, in headlines, in the quiet hallways of a town still unsure how to carry the weight of what had happened under its own roof. Hamilton County elected a new sheriff. White, male, traditional. His campaign ran on a promise to restore order. He removed Loretta's portrait from the department lobby within the first week. No ceremony, no statement, just gone. The house on Sycamore Street was sold at auction. The flower bed out front was paved over. The mailbox replaced. No trace left of the family that once lived there. Darnell moved to another state, changed his number, filed a civil lawsuit for emotional damages. The case never made it to court. He lived, but not as the man he was before. EJ never spoke to him again. And Loretta, she served her time in a women's correctional facility 2 hours south of home. She taught GED classes, led meditation groups, volunteered in the infirmary, never once complained, never once requested early parole. She told the board, I'll walk out when my son's ready to look me in the eye and say he's healed, not a day sooner. She was released after serving 4 years. No press, no welcome committee, just a bus stop and a sky that looked the same as the day she left. She didn't go back to law enforcement, didn't write a book, didn't speak to reporters. She moved into a small apartment near the edge of town, found work at a nonprofit for abused children. Quiet, steady, far from the spotlight. EJ graduated high school with honors. He didn't attend the ceremony, but he mailed his diploma to her. Inside the envelope, 1 note, 2 words. You kept me. She framed it. No photo, no fanfare. Just that note, in a plain black frame, sitting beside her bed. Some stories don't have clean endings. No perfect justice, No final piece, just survivors, and silence, and the choice to keep going anyway. That night, Loretta stood by the window and stared out into the dark. No footsteps, no locked doors, just wind brushing against the glass, and the sound of nothing. For the first time in a long time, she smiled, and the world, unaware, kept turning. Now it's your turn. What would you have done? Would you wait for the system or protect your child by any means necessary? Because sometimes justice doesn't come in a courtroom. Sometimes it comes with a pair of scissors. Subscribe if you're still listening, because stories like this aren't rare. They're just buried. And the truth is, we've only just begun.